It's Christmas 406 and hundreds of thousands of cold, hungry refugees are huddled along the banks of the Rhine River. They are desperate people, for they have just escaped hell. Their homes have been ravaged by the Huns. They have just barely survived an attack by the Franks. Their only hope for salvation is to force their way into the Western Roman Empire and try to carve out a new home in these rich lands. One of the groups on the banks of the Rhine is the Vandals. There is nothing remarkable about them right now, but soon their name will be associated with destruction. Among the Vandals is a 17-year-old named Geiseric. He is the half-brother of King Gunderic. This teenager doesn't know it yet, but he is destined to destroy the Western Roman Empire. In 407, a barbarian horde of Vandals, Alans, and Suevi breached Roman defenses and flooded into Gaul, modern-day France. We don't have exact numbers, but there were probably over 30,000 warriors and over 100,000 people in total. The Roman legions in Gaul were overwhelmed, and they were furious that the imperial government in Italy seemed more focused on the Visigoths in the east than this catastrophe unfolding along the Rhine. A common soldier named Constantine was declared emperor by the legions in Roman Britain. He mobilized all the legions in Britain, crossed the Channel, and pledged to destroy the barbarian horde. The legions in Gaul rallied to the new emperor. For the Vandals and the other invaders, this Roman civil war could not have come at a better time. All Gaul was filled with the smoke of a single funeral pyre. After devastating Gaul, the horde forced their way through the Pyrenees Mountains into Roman Spain. The Spaniards in the cities and forts who had survived the disasters surrendered themselves to servitude under the barbarians. The tribes divided Spain among themselves. They were settled on the far western corner of the Western Roman Empire, far from their power base in Italy. It seemed like they could rest and live off the land that they had just stolen. But of course, it's not going to be that simple. By 416, the Romans had gotten their act together and made an alliance with the Visigoths. A massive Roman Visigothic force moved into Spain and struck at the barbarians. The Alans, who were ruling over the Vandals and the Suevi, suffered such heavy losses at the hands of the Goths that the few survivors placed themselves under the protection of Gunderic, the king of the Vandals who had settled in Galicia. It was a devastating assault, and most of Spain returned to Roman control. It seemed like only a matter of time before the Vandals would also be destroyed. In 422, the Romans tried to finish the job. A Roman Visigothic force attacked the Vandals, but the Visigoths betrayed the Romans, and the Vandals won a massive victory. This battle is enormous. The whole history of Europe and the world is different if this battle goes a different way. Yet, like so many things about this time, we know very little about the details. After this, the Western Roman Empire was engulfed in another civil war because, it's the Romans. The Vandals were left alone in Spain, and in 428, Geiseric became king. I know it's been a while since we heard that name. The new king has an interesting decision to make. It's been over 20 years since the Vandals were one of many tribes to cross the Rhine River, and during that time, they've been pretty much constantly battling and moving. They've lost a lot of people, but they're actually stronger than they were at the beginning because they've absorbed the remnants of some of these other tribes. Given that they've established themselves pretty securely in southern Spain, they seem to be in a strong position. But there's still a vulnerability. Spain is pretty far away from Italy, but the Romans can still march and supply an army there. The Vandals have already survived 2 Roman attacks. A third one is probably going to come. So the new king looked at the situation and asked, if the Romans are going to attack, is this the best place for us to be? This is the ancient city of Carthage. Today, it is not a particularly wealthy area, but in the ancient world, it was one of the richest. Before the Romans, the Carthaginians built one of the great ancient civilizations here. They actually fought the Romans in a series of wars that almost resulted in the destruction of Rome. But the Romans triumphed and destroyed the city of Carthage. It was Julius Caesar who decided to rebuild it, and it became one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. Roman Africa, centered on Carthage, produced the grain, olive oil, and wine that kept the bloated cities of Italy fed. An enormous number of ships carried these goods from Africa to Italy. There was extra space on the ships, and so other goods would piggyback off of this trade. All of this production and trade was taxed, and with Gaul, Spain, and even Italy ravaged by barbarians, the Western Roman Empire depended on this tax revenue to fund its army. Africa was the spine of the Western Roman Empire. It kept it standing upright. Geiseric intended to break it. In 429, Geiseric and 80,000 Vandals moved into Africa. After overcoming stiff resistance in Numidia, they were met by a force of the Eastern Roman Empire. The two forces shadowed one another, neither willing to risk a major battle. In 435, they came to terms. Geiseric gained control over Numidia. He was technically ruling it on behalf of the Romans, but he could do whatever he wanted. Geiseric was focused on consolidating his power over this new land, and it was easier than you might think it would be. There wasn't a sense of nationalism back then that would have caused mass resistance to the Vandals. He seized land for his followers, but mostly from absentee landowners in Italy. He didn't have this bloated bureaucracy to support, so he was able to lower taxes, and people love tax cuts. And most importantly, he allowed the locals to practice their version of Christianity. So for most of the locals, Vandal rule was an improvement over Roman rule, assuming that you hadn't had a loved one killed or a home burned down when the Vandals were conquering the place. For 4 years, Geiseric honored his treaty with the Romans. When the East Romans went home and the West Romans were busy dealing with the revolt in Gaul, Geiseric made his move on Carthage. 10 years after boldly crossing over from Spain, and over 32 years after crossing the Rhine, Geiseric and his Vandals were in control of the most important province of the Western Roman Empire. And there was nothing the Romans right now could do about it. Amphibious attacks are difficult under the best of circumstances, and these were not the best of circumstances. The reason is that for the next 10 years, the Romans were distracted fighting for their lives against Attila the Hun. Time was on the Vandals' side because the loss of Africa put the Western Roman Empire into a death spiral. The loss of so much tax revenue meant that the Romans could not maintain a large standing army, which means that they had to outsource their defense to barbarian tribes, who in turn demanded more land, which means the Romans got even less tax revenue, and thus continuing the cycle. The bottom line was that if they could not take Africa back, the Western Roman Empire was doomed, and Geiseric did everything in his power to make sure that they couldn't. The capture of Carthage was so sudden and unexpected that Geiseric actually captured a big chunk of the Roman navy. The Vandals themselves were not sea people, but the local Romano-Africans were, and they were happy to pilot these ships if they could get some loot out of it. Thus, Geiseric's Vandal kingdom became a nest of pirates. Adventurers fanned out across the Mediterranean, capturing ships and plundering the coast. The Pax Romana that had allowed unprecedented commerce from one end of the ancient world to the other unraveled. This made the Vandals very rich, and it is good to be rich. You can pay people off to make them loyal to you, you can pay for ships and mercenaries, and of course you can bribe people in other countries so that they give you information. It always seemed like the Vandals knew exactly what the Romans were doing. So now we skip ahead to the death of Attila the Hun in 453. The Western Roman Empire at this point barely has an army and barely has a navy. It was economically ruined. Geiseric pounced on the tottering empire. His forces seized key islands in the Mediterranean. Then Geiseric landed his forces on the outskirts of an undefended Rome. The Pope approached Geiseric to negotiate the city's surrender. Geiseric promised not to slaughter the citizens or burn the city down, so the gates were open to him. Now, Geiseric kept his word about not slaughtering people and burning the city down. However, he stripped the city bare. Thousands of Roman citizens were taken back to Africa as slaves. Every bit of treasure he could find was seized, and even the imperial family was abducted. It was a display of sheer dominance by the Vandal. Just think, at the beginning of the story, he was one of many refugees huddled along the frozen banks of the Rhine River. Now he is strolling into the most famous city in the world and taking whatever he wants. So this is a low point for the Western Roman Empire. But they are not done yet. In the aftermath of the brutal sack of Rome, the last great leader of the Western Roman Empire emerges. His name is Majorian. Somehow, with his threadbare army and shrewd diplomacy, Majorian is able to bring the barbarian tribes to heel and restore Roman control over Gaul and Spain. He knew that these gains would be for naught if they could not take back Africa, so he prepared to strike at the Vandals. 300 ships were assembled in southern Spain. It seemed like Majorian was actually going to follow the same path that Geiseric had taken 30 years earlier. It could have worked if he was facing a lesser man than Geiseric. With the help of traders, he launched a surprise attack and destroyed Majorian's fleet. This debacle gave Majorian's enemies the ammunition they needed to destroy him. So they stripped, tortured, and killed him. The Western Roman Empire descended into another round of chaos, which it would never recover from. But remember, there are two Roman empires. To its credit, the Eastern Roman Empire did not give up on the West until the very end. In 468, they emptied the treasury and assembled one of the most impressive armadas of the ancient world. We're talking 1,100 ships, 30,000 men. This is a serious force. Their target, of course, was the Vandal kingdom in Africa. If this force had been able to land in Africa, then not even Geiseric would have been able to defeat it. With the help of spies, Geiseric was able to track this fleet as it approached his kingdom. And on one day, there was favorable winds pinning that fleet against the shore, and that's when Geiseric struck. When the Vandals came near, they set fire to the boats which they were towing, and when their sails were bellied by the wind, they let them go against the Roman fleet. And since there were a great number of ships there, those boats easily spread fire wherever they struck, and were themselves readily destroyed together with those with which they came into contact. The Roman fleet broke into chaos as fire spread everywhere, and then the Vandal fleet came in to finish the job. The shattered remains of this force headed back east. The expedition had been a complete fiasco. This was bad for the East Romans, but even worse for the Western Roman Empire. It had been 40 years since the Vandals took control of Africa. The Western Roman army was non-existent. Gaul and Spain were gone. There wasn't even enough tax revenue coming in to pay off the barbarians anymore. In 476, a barbarian warlord named Odoacer decided that it wasn't even worth having a Western Roman Empire anymore. He established his own kingdom in Italy. The Western Roman Empire was dead. Geiseric, the man who had done more than anyone else to destroy it, died 1 year later. It might sound like a bold claim to say that one man destroyed the Western Roman Empire, but consider the counterfactual. Let's say that Geiseric is killed during the many battles he fought on that migration from the Rhine River to Spain. Another leader decides to just stay in Spain, which would have been a very rational thing to do. The Western Roman Empire is still going to have a rough time. They have constant civil wars. They got barbarian tribes running wild. They got Attila the Hun knocking on their door. But remember, even with the loss of Africa, they got through all of that. Now imagine if during that whole time they had more tax revenue coming in to pay for a bigger army, to pay off barbarians. And remember, it's not just losing that tax revenue. Geiseric's Vandal kingdom was launching pirate raids across the Mediterranean and even sacked Rome. I think if you look at this alternative timeline where the Vandals stay in Africa, the Western Roman Empire survives into the Middle Ages. So if you ever get a time machine, instead of killing Hitler, consider going back to the early 5th century and removing Geiseric from the picture. I want to see what that timeline looks like. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.